Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Today, the topic is the 2024 election. But first, we're joined by Lindsay Weber, reporter from The Morning Call. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
You filed a story about the race for Congress in District 7. Briefly, which part of Pennsylvania is that?
Sure. So PA7 is the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. So that's Northampton, Lehigh counties, also Carbon County just north, and a small part of Monroe County.
And give us a brief bio on the candidates in District 7. Who are they, Lindsay?
Sure. So Susan Wild is the Democratic incumbent. She's running for her fourth term, representing this district in Congress. Before that, she was a lawyer for an Allentown firm. Ryan McKenzie is the Republican nominee running for this same seat, and he's currently a state representative in the Emmaus and Macungie area, and he's been representing that state district for about 6 terms.
Why is this race important, Lindsay, and why is it attracting attention?
Sure. So Susan Wild is considered a vulnerable incumbent. She has, won re-election in the past, but this is a pretty mixed district, with a fair amount of, moderate and independent voters. So it really could swing either way. And that's why it's being targeted by both Democrats and Republicans for control of the House next year.
Now, I understand The Morning Call had access to the candidates, and you did those interviews. How did you decide on which issues to cover during your interviews?
Sure. So we actually sent out a survey to our readers, and they selected kind of the top issues that are on their mind going into the election. And, none of that is really going to surprise you. People talked about inflation, about immigration, about abortion, top issues.
So why don't we start with inflation, Lindsay? What are the candidates' views on that? Let's start with Susan Wild.
Sure. So Susan Wild is really trying to emphasize her record in lowering costs in Congress. So in that question, she talked about her efforts, lowering prescription drug costs and her future priority of passing a bill to limit the cost of childcare. Ryan McKenzie, on the other hand, has criticized Democratic leadership for spending. Democrats have passed, major trillions of dollars of spending bills, and he's kind of blamed the inflation on, major spending that, potentially has contributed to higher costs.
Now, Lindsay, that immigration at our southern border is certainly a hot issue lately. What do the candidates have to say about that?
Sure. So, that seems to be, one of these really thorny issues. Susan Wild has, talked about a bipartisan bill crafted in the Senate, but that did not see a vote in the House because Trump had asked House Republicans not to support it, not to vote on it, even though it did have some bipartisan support in the Senate. So Susan Wild kind of pointed to that specific bill as, sort of her views on immigration. She wants to see more Border Patrol agents, and she wants to see more of an enforcement and a reform of the immigration system. Ryan McKenzie, on the other hand, has really spoken in favor of finishing building a wall at that border, and talked about, how that physical barrier is really important for, limiting the amount of people that are coming into the country without authorization.
Here's another issue, Lindsay, that's getting a lot of attention in this election in Pennsylvania, and that would be abortion. What did Ryan McKenzie have to say about that?
Right. So Ryan McKenzie, he's previously used the word pro-life to describe himself, but it seems like, now that we are in the general election, not the Republican primary, he's tried to move away from that specific language and emphasize, other issues that have to do with, motherhood and maternal health without, touching specifically on abortion. He's talked about helping establish the Maternal Mortality Review Committee in the state government here, and, talked about how he thinks that there are more issues than just abortion that, affect motherhood.
Mm-hmm. Now, public safety, Lindsay, has polled high as a concern here in Pennsylvania. How do the candidates compare on this subject?
Right. So Susan Wild, she's, spoken in favor of, police departments and talked about how she's helped secure funding for police departments in the Lehigh Valley. And she came on pretty strong in her answer supporting a ban on assault weapons. Ryan McKenzie, on the other hand, has kind of, criticized Democrats for what he sees as, them not supporting police departments enough, as well as, talking about some of what he's done to make sure domestic abusers don't have access to guns while still, making sure that law-abiding citizens still, are able to have guns in this country.
Here's an issue we hear about almost every day, and that would be the U.S. handling of the wars in the Mideast and in Ukraine. Did the candidates check in on this subject?
Right. So Ryan McKenzie, again, he, is being critical of, the Democratic leadership and the Biden-Harris administration on that, considering the fact that, neither conflict has yet come to a peaceful resolution. Obviously, both of them, spoke in support of Ukraine and spoke in support of Israel in, their war efforts. Susan Wild, on the other hand, is talking about how there need to be continuing efforts for diplomacy and continuing to, support these countries that are our allies.
Lindsay, we have about a minute left. How about the subject of climate change? Is that important to these candidates?
Right. So that was, an issue that came up for our readers. And it was interesting to me, at least, how there were some similarities in Susan Wild and Ryan McKenzie's responses on that. To me, that was, where the candidates kind of had the most similarity. Both of them talked about, how, there needs to be all sorts of different solutions to our energy needs. Neither one, for example, came out in support of banning fracking and talked about, being supportive of clean energy, but also continuing to, have natural gas as well.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay Weber from The Morning Call.
Thanks so much.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after a short break. Welcome back. Our guests are both political science professors. Alison Dagnes is from Shippensburg University, and Fletcher McClellan is from Elizabethtown College. A headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer read, "College students could have big sway in this election." Now, you see this population up close. Fletcher, how does it look to you?
Well, I think that's true. The question really is how many will turn out to vote. It's a traditionally problematic vote. Students have lots to do, including their studies. They're thinking about the future, they're thinking about jobs. And I think there is enthusiasm about this campaign and about at the top of the ticket and in some of the other races as well. I would say compared to other campaigns, I'm not seeing the kind of real energy, at least on my campus, that I've seen in previous campaigns.
I wonder why that is, Fletcher.
Well, I think this generation in particular is really worried, and they are somewhat pessimistic. We've been in a pretty good economy, but inflation has taken its toll. They're thinking about jobs. The economy has slowed down in the past year in order to deal with the inflation problem. So I think they're concerned about that. I think, there are issues, of course, like abortion, which I think is energizing young people, especially young women. I think there's concern about what is going on with Israel and Gaza, and we're, on the first anniversary of the beginning of that war. So there are a lot of different concerns, but I think mainly they're thinking about jobs, they're thinking about debt, college debt, things like that. And so a lot of that, I think, is sort of weighing them down. We've heard a lot about, mental health issues, for everybody, not just students, but it certainly is a concern.
Alison, how's the energy in your classroom?
I think it depends on the classroom, right? For intro students who are not majors, who are taking U.S. government and politics as a gen ed, the energy is not particularly high. Fletcher is absolutely right. And one of the, I've tried to figure this out. Why is it that students really are taking their foot off the gas? And I think a lot of this has to do with just feeling overwhelmed. So today is the first anniversary of the attacks in Israel. It's also the first Monday in October, so it's the first day of the Supreme Court session. Tomorrow marks 4 weeks until a presidential election, an election that could turn over control of the House and the Senate. I feel like we've had an October surprise every single month since May. It is just, it's overwhelming. There's too much to really hold on to. And so the students who aren't naturally gravitating towards politics and towards government, I think they feel a little done with it all. Conversely, in my upper level classes of majors, they're very knowledgeable. But what's been really fascinating to me is how different their knowledge is about different topics, because the media landscape now is so super fragmented that students will get certain amounts of information from mainstream media and then other bits of news and information from a podcast. And so all of this means that you have this wide swath of a demographic that is very difficult to stereotype.
Right.
Simply because of the number of things that are concerned to students here. Because as Alison said, it's fragmented, not like it used to be.
Yeah, and there is interest for sure, as much interest as there is in any campaign. But translated into energy, political activity, as Alison said, I think it's they're kind of immobilized.
Could I just add on something to that? Because Fletcher's totally right. I always push back on the canard that college students are liberal activists, all of whom are protesting and holding riots and all of this sort of stuff. All of the spring last year, Shippensburg didn't have one protest about Gaza. We didn't have an encampment. We didn't have any of that stuff. And in fact, most of my students are more conservative than not, more Republican affiliated than not. So this idea that young rabble-rousers are there to, take it to the streets and take it to the man.
We expect a more liberal point of view on campus, don't we?
Yeah, and that's not really the case.
Yeah.
And as far as a voting bloc is concerned, let's try to get some perspective on this. Now, Fletcher already pointed out that often young voters can be fickle about, they feel a certain way, but they might not be going to the polls. So let's consider just how big is that voting bloc amongst college students. And let's consider these are 18-year-olds, and a lot of them are voting for the first time. Probably some anxiety, maybe even some tension induced by a race like this.
Sure. I think a couple things are happening at the same time. One of which is that if you are a young Republican, you've only seen Donald Trump be a presidential candidate on the Republican side your entire adult life. And so, therefore, it may not be as exciting as it was in 2016. And the other part is,
Oh, is that so? There can be some fatigue after a candidate runs more than one time?
Absolutely.
Even though he was president. Is that right? That hadn't occurred to me.
And on the other side, last spring, when it was just a rematch of 2020 between Biden and Trump,
right?
That was a tough sell to try and get students interested in the election at all.
It couldn't be deader.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the movement from Biden to Harris, I think, energized
let's talk about that.
a little bit. It energized some folks.
All of a sudden, there is a young female alternative to Joe Biden.
Exactly, and last spring it was there was really nothing going on, and people were thinking, oh my God, do we have to do this again?
Right.
But there is now real interest. There is certainly more interest in Harris than there is in Trump, because Trump is a known quantity, and Trump is doing what he has always done. He's pretty consistent. Pretty consistent in his inconsistency. But people are still, learning more about her, and her campaign is doing both things. They're trying to inform people about the vice president. Even though she's been vice president, people still don't know a whole lot. And they're also, of course, pointing out, some of the problems with what could happen with the second Trump presidency.
And even though she was vice president for a while, now people are paying attention to her for the first time.
Right.
That's very normal, I think, isn't it, Fletcher?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
the statistic that I love to go back to all the time is that when Dick Cheney was vice president, and among those of us who paid attention, we thought he was the more powerful between he and President Bush, and we knew everything about Dick Cheney. To the point that when he, in a hunting accident, shot a lawyer in the face.
I remember.
There was polling that was done afterwards, and 41% of the American public knew who Dick Cheney was. And that was after there was just wall-to-wall coverage of the fact that the vice president, by accident, shot somebody.
It's ironic that an incident
Right.
like that should attract attention.
Right.
People just don't know that much about the vice president.
Now, give me some insight into your classes. I always wish I could be a fly on the wall in the classroom and see how much the election is discussed in your classroom, and what does the young people want to know? Now, Alison talked about students having a certain level of knowledge about certain subjects, but tell me, what gets them motivated or excited to look up during class?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it because students are social media oriented and even more to the point, more entertainment directed. They are drawn toward, some of the unusual parts of the campaign. It's usually, I have to say this, I mean, it's still dominated by Trump because Trump is good at saying something outrageous, at least 3 times a day. And his vice presidential candidate, Senator Vance, has also joined in on this. But a lot of this, and this is kind of like the national media as well, is sort of responding to what the latest outrage happens to be. And, I think a lot of my class time is spent not trying to talk about the former president and not getting, to what he said, because it is pretty much designed just to get reaction, to get clicks, to get ratings.
You likened it to entertainment just a minute ago.
To entertainment, attention. And my students understand that. They understand there's a bigger picture here. They're very concerned, and I didn't say this before, they are very concerned about the democracy issue. January 6th is, even though it happened 3.5 years ago, is a real thing to them. They think about the dangers of it. They think about the kind of country, the kind of democracy that we're going to be. They think about, who are we really as Americans? How much they're very much they've been socialized into being tolerant of others, tolerant of diversity, embracing diversity. It's not, I think, so much an indoctrination as some might say, but it's something that they've come to believe in, certainly with regards to LGBTQ issues. And it puzzles them about why they see a lot of intolerance. I think that's what really gets to them.
Let's talk some more about that riot that was on January 6th. And you said to your students that it is a real concern, it's a real thing. And maybe that's because it was so well documented on video. So certainly we can easily, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
It is. The question then is, are students actually seeing those pictures? And I will say that social media has become very sophisticated of late. And last year, a student came into my office and said, "Can you tell me more about Project 2025?" And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I just saw TikTok." And I thought, oh, well, TikTok. Turns out TikTok was right on it before anybody else was. So so there are times that students, and I think the rest of us, can get a lot of good information from social media.
Yeah.
And then there are times when you can avoid all of the real news and fact-based journalism that you want to. And we see that not just with students, but I think with everybody. So in terms of right-wing media, which really doesn't cover the January 6th event, fallout, the issues, the questions that come of this, there is some pushback that this was not that big a deal because those on the right who wrap themselves in a media ecosystem that has consistently downplayed this, they do not see this as being a major issue. And that is a major problem, because this is where the media's gatekeeping function is so vital. And so when Fox, et cetera, are not covering this, or saying, this is just a Democratic talking point, that's deeply problematic. And I think a lot of people push back and say, no, it's really not that big a deal, but it is.
And Alison, since you brought it up, we better discuss it for a minute. I think, did you call it Project 2025? Is that what
I did.
Is that the official name? And when that came to my attention, my understanding is that it doesn't have Trump's fingerprints on it. It has the participation of people from his administration, just so people know what they're reading if they choose to do that.
Right.
Yeah, this is a document from the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Washington that's been around forever. And it's not surprising that a conservative think tank would want to have a kind of playbook for what would a second Trump administration be, and that's what this is. What is sort of surprising is just how expansive and well documented and deep and sourced this document is. It's over 900 pages long, and hundreds of people worked on this, and it's very detailed. And so it began to get kind of a negative connotation to it, which is why former President Trump pushed back on it and said that this wasn't his. But in fact, Tim Walz, the Democrat vice presidential candidate, said, I've never had a playbook that I didn't use. And in truth, Donald Trump is a lot of things. He's not exactly a policy wonk. And so it would not at all surprise me if somebody came to him with an almost 1,000-page policy book and said, here, everybody who used to work for you wrote this, and we think you're going to like it, that he would actually pick that up and use it as his playbook. That just seems to make a lot of sense. There's nothing illegal or nefarious about it, but if you want to know what a second Trump administration would look like, it's online. You can read it for free.
Right.
So what role is Pennsylvania playing in this presidential election? How important is it? Why is it important, Fletcher?
Well, we're ground zero, I think, in the campaign. I think as much, or certainly per capita, more money is being poured into this state than to any other. There's 19 electoral votes. It's integral to the Harris strategy of getting to 270. There are pathways, I think, that she could use without Pennsylvania. She's campaigning hard in North Carolina, for example. Remember, President Biden had 306 electoral votes. He carried, in addition to the Rust Belt states, he carried Georgia and Arizona, and she's competing there. But Harris could lose those states and still have 270 plus. The thing is, though, for Trump, I think, has put practically all his eggs into the Pennsylvania basket. I don't think he sees there's any other way without winning, carrying his states, also, of course, carrying Georgia and Arizona. But I think he sees Pennsylvania as the prime target, and he is spending a lot of time here, and Harris is as well. But I think both in terms of his money, in terms of his advertising, in terms of his presence, the selection of Senator Vance from neighboring state Ohio, all this was geared to a Pennsylvania strategy. So I think it's practically all or nothing for him.
So tunnel vision with Pennsylvania isn't necessarily the way to go. After all, if you lose Pennsylvania, you can compensate for that, can't you, by winning other states?
You can, but Fletcher is again correct. The idea of the big blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that Michigan and Wisconsin are fairly similar to one another, and therefore where goes one, probably the other one will go as well. That has always been something that Democrats have seen as kind of a bulwark against their electoral losses, and then suddenly in 2016 they lost them. And so Pennsylvania and Georgia are fundamental to the Trump campaign, and Harris is doing something different because Trump is really doing a mobilization campaign where he's trying to mobilize his existing support base, and Harris is doing a persuasion campaign. And she really is focusing on not only the 7 swing states, which now includes North Carolina, but also, states that might be probably a reach like Florida and Texas, but she's focusing there too because she's doing something different. She's really trying to energize Democrats and folks who had been disaffected by having to do the 2020 election one more time, and say, no, come on back. We have a chance here. And so she sees Pennsylvania as fundamentally important, as does Trump, but she also is, I think, taking a wider look and doing a different kind of campaign.
Yeah, and one other thing is that this state is just so darn close. It is 50-50. In 2016, there was just 40,000 votes between Trump and Hillary Clinton, 80,000 votes last time around. So, both sides think it's a winnable race.
What accounts for that split right down the middle? That's what interests me. Why is it so close?
Do you want to take this?
We are, we're a diverse state, for one thing. I mean, in terms of being industrial, being rural, having large metropolitan areas, especially Philadelphia and suburbs, and then, smaller cities, the Harrisburgs, the Yorks, the Hazeltons, and on down. So there's, economically, we're diverse. We're not quite as diverse as other states in terms of people of color, but there's still, are significant segments. We're an older state, which means generally that we'll have turnout because older people tend to turn out. I think one of the underdeveloped themes here is the competition for the older vote. I mean, everyone is talking about, and we're talking about the college age vote, the younger vote. But I think they're older people. Obviously, they're concerned about Social Security. They're concerned about Medicare, things like that. But I think they're also concerned about they're concerned about the democracy issue. They're concerned about Trump's decorum or lack of decorum. And I think. One thing I heard the Harris campaign say is with these seven swing states, it's basically you're trying to run 7 gubernatorial campaigns. You're running as if you were running for governor of Pennsylvania. So both these campaigns are just are fanning out, to all corners of the state. It's pretty remarkable.
Can I just add on to that? I think that Pennsylvania is different than especially North Carolina and Georgia, because we are a fairly static state where there isn't much movement, there isn't much growth. If you look at Georgia, particularly the area around Atlanta, there's just tons of young people who are moving there. Same thing with the Research Triangle in North Carolina.
So older people tend to stay in PA?
And younger people too. We don't have that kind of elastic electorate the way, you look at Arizona and Nevada. Lots of people are moving there. And so because we are so static and because we are so evenly divided between the cities and the rural areas and then the ex-urban areas, between Democrats and Republicans, that's why, time after time, we are always a swing state. At least we have in modern elections.
All right, I'm going to give you folks a break for a minute while we look at program notes for here on PCN. The PA Chamber of Business and Industry is having their annual dinner program today. Chamber President and CEO Luke Bernstein and Board Chair Manny Marr will make remarks this evening live at 6:10 p.m. When they finish, we'll cut away from the event and return to it at 7:20 p.m. when U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and U.S. Senator Marco Rubio will join the program. We have a new Capitol Blue Cross Forum for you with David Merritt, Senior Vice President at Blue Cross Blue Shield. He's on this evening at 9 o'clock. Tomorrow in the PCN Capitol Preview, the PA House agenda will be our topic. Majority Leader Matt Bradford and Minority Leader Brian Cutler will be our guests. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 o'clock. The PA Democratic State Committee hosted their Independence Dinner with Governor Josh Shapiro in attendance. You can watch that event on PCN Thursday at 1 p.m. A Journalist Roundtable returns with Stephen Caruso from Spotlight PA, Gillian McGoldrick from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Taylor Millard from the Delaware Valley Journal. They'll update us on news from the state capitol on Thursday at 7 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free on the internet. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is Everything Pennsylvania. We're a 501c3 nonprofit television network that relies on viewers and donors like you to help continue our mission. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now we're talking about the presidential election and particularly the interest among young people. And as far as voter registration is concerned among young people, what's going on there? Are you able to see, are there drives on campus to get young people registered?
Oh, yeah. I mean, big ones. But as Fletcher's already noted, there's a big difference between registering and actually voting.
Right. I'm trying to separate those two. Right.
But if you register, chances are you will vote.
Uh-huh. But like you said, Fletcher, young people got a lot of things on their plate, I suppose. Yeah. And their future, that certainly would weigh heavily on my shoulders.
Right. And, here in the state, of course, there are vote-by-mail options, and I think students are taking a lot of advantage of that. Because back home, where they are, some are registering on campus, where it's the most convenient, but back home, wherever they're from, there may well be some important races, whether they're congressional or state legislative.
Now, let's talk about the issues some more. Now, Alison already mentioned that there's a fragmented area, scope of issues out there, but let's try to pin down just a few issues that are very important to young people for this presidential election. Alison, lead us off there.
Well, I think we've already mentioned it, but the economy is very important to them, not in terms of the economic data and how the nation is doing, but really their own wallets, right? I mean, they're very concerned.
Their own personal situation.
Absolutely.
And young people.
Right. Yes, and things are expensive, and college educations are expensive, even at public schools. So students are energized by that. They're energized by the issue of women's reproductive rights and the questions surrounding abortion. And then, a couple of weeks ago, suddenly we all started talking about if people were eating cats and dogs and had to shift that into a more serious discussion about immigration. And so, all three of these things, I think, are top of mind for many Americans. College students are no different.
Right. Yeah, and I think, abortion is sort of, if it's not the most important issue, it's right up there. But it's not just abortion per se, because we're talking about reproductive health and freedom. We're talking about abortion being based in law on the right to privacy, which supports basically people's right to make the personal choices about their lives that they think are best for them. So, this brings in LGBTQ rights, this brings in birth control, this brings in, family and marriage and those sorts of prospects. And those things are, by the way, are not, totally out of the minds of students. They're looking for potential partners down the road. But I think it's a cluster of issues that abortion symbolizes, not so much, do I have the right to get an abortion or not, but it's a cluster of issues that the concerns that students are very concerned about, their personal freedom.
And adding on to that, I think that the Republican Party is sending a lot of different mixed messages right now, which is not doing them very much help.
Give an example, please.
Okay. So recently, Melania Trump, she's releasing a book. She has released several promotional videos for this, which really are it's not very political. These videos are very artsy and sort of, they look more like perfume ads really than they do any kind of...
A serious political ad?
Yeah, yes. And so in these videos for her book, she says that she is not only, pro-choice, but thinks that a woman should have her right to terminate a pregnancy, which flies wildly in the face of what her husband has not only said in the past, but enacted in terms of the Supreme Court nominees that he has chosen. And so he is trying to, I think, have it both ways, to say that he is pro-life, but that he is married to someone, and I think that could be a very relatable thing, to be married to somebody who feels very differently than you. And then over the weekend, J.D. Vance, his running mate, said that if elected, Donald Trump would defund Planned Parenthood. And so the messages here are just wildly all over the place. And I think students find that annoying. If they had one stand on it, they probably should take it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and of course, Trump himself has been all over the map. I mean, he's proud of appointing the justices that voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. But at the same time, he says, "So I'm going to veto a national abortion ban." He says it's really up to the states, and and so that means that in some states you'll have full reproductive health and freedom, but in others you will have virtually no option if you're pregnant, but to carry through the pregnancy, otherwise incur substantial costs trying to go to another state. So it's another way in which he's trying to have it both ways. And I don't think students find him very trustworthy on that.
Especially when, for many religious Republicans, the issue of IVF was raised over the summer, and in response to that, that is something that the deeply religious pro-life community,
in vitro fertilization,
has been, very consistent on. And so after there were several actions at the state level to ban it and then not ban it, Donald Trump came out with a statement that said if he were elected president, the government would pay for all IVF. And that just feels sort of, it was obviously something that he said from the hip, but again, is that real? Is that true? It seems expensive, and also that really flies in the face of what your party and those who are most passionate about this issue, what they believe.
I like to think about how young people are getting their news about the election and what they're paying attention to. And immediately I think of influencers. Do they have a role in conveying information? You're nodding a lot, Alison.
She is the expert.
Influencers are tremendously important, and so much so that over the weekend, Vice President Harris taped a podcast with one of the most important podcasters and influencers on a show called Call Her Daddy. And that reaches, I think it's like 40 million American young people. So,
and what do they like about this person?
She is Alex Cooper, I think is her name. And she speaks to young, especially young women, in a way that has been very non-political. And so there's an attraction there. And as the mainstream media especially has been jumping up and down and pulling at their bald spots, saying that Vice President Harris hasn't done enough media, I think that she's organizing an influencer campaign that's reaching very niche audiences and specific demographics that she wants to encourage. And so she has been getting her name out there, especially with the influencers.
So is Trump making any effort then to connect with this generation through influencers now, specifically?
Well, that would be, the right-wing networks. I think, for one thing, he tends to have an older base, and so the traditional mainstream organs, such as Fox News, certainly are good for him. Right-wing talk radio, overwhelmingly, radio has conservative talk hosts. They are pulling, for him, and he makes himself available there. As to what he's doing on social media, I think a lot of it are things that are targeted mainly to conservative listeners.
And I would just add, that's exactly right. I mean, Fox is clearly his happy place. But he also has done a really good job of going on different kind of bro culture podcasts in order to reach that a more masculine, a younger male audience. And so he's reaching out to those niche audiences too. And I think we should note that former President Trump came back to Butler, Pennsylvania over the weekend, the site of his first assassination attempt this campaign season. And with him was Elon Musk, who owns Twitter. And so, Twitter has become a very pro-Trump outlet, even though Donald Trump owns Truth Social and uses that as his primary social media outlet. He still is getting a lot of attention and support from Elon Musk and from those on right-wing Twitter.
And by this is also, as you gather from how Alison has described this, where Trump is trying to appeal mainly to mobilize young men and Harris to mobilize young women. I mean, this gets at the so-called gender gap where women tend to vote Democratic, men tend to vote Republican. And this is actually now even possibly even greater among younger Americans. And where women, for example, mobilized by the end of Roe v. Wade, men who, there's now a pretty steady stream of information about the kinds of problems that men are experiencing, especially with regards to health and life expectancy and drug overdose and things like that. And that women are moving ahead in higher education. They, now nearly 60% of undergraduate degrees are earned by women. The majority of master's degrees, doctoral programs, law students, medical students, the majority are all female. So, on the one hand, this is super, and this is potentially a very active base for Harris. At the same time, and something that Trump has to really deal with. But at the same time, Trump has advantages among young men, especially a population that feels kind of demoralized, that feels like they're being left behind.
If they have a grievance.
They have grievances, and that women's gains are at their expense. And so, from Trump and also Vance, who's really sort of taken on this idea of the traditional family, and that women ought to be making babies, and that's their role. And celebrating the male breadwinner, all that is, really trying to bring back the whole idea of male privilege. That, as I say, this is a real battleground among young people in terms of gender politics.
That is such an outstanding point. This entire presidential election, and we see it really dropping down to the down ballot races as well, has been very gendered. It's been this question of masculinity, right? And so even when it was Joe Biden who was the Democratic candidate, Trump was positioning himself as the strong one versus the weak. And then when it became Vice President Harris as the candidate, then it became a strong man versus a woman. And that has played out not only in terms of the issues, because we talked about reproductive rights already, but also in the ways that masculinity has been portrayed in this campaign. And on the right, I mean, if you look at the Republican National Convention, the wrestler, now I can't think of his name, Hulk Hogan was there, and the head of WWE or WWF, whatever it is, was there too. It's this very like aggressively bro culture kind of masculine positioning. But on the Democratic side, I don't think it's a coincidence that Tim Walz is referred to not as governor, but as coach, right? It's the idea that, what is more masculine than a football coach? One of the ads that he has out now is about him changing a transmission or a carburetor or something. It's very no, we've got real, dad and guy culture also. It's just really contrasting from what Trump is selling.
And when coach talks, we have to listen,
That's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly it.
As far as voting is concerned, again, as I pointed this out earlier in the program, this is a new task for a lot of young people. And I know it's not news to you to consider that an election like this can cause tension or anxiety among adults. I wonder how young people view that, especially if they're voting for the first time and they see a certain level of anxiety or even hostility out there.
I'm not sure that is happening. I'm sure it's happening in some places, but I think it's more aversion to conflict. I think students really don't want to get involved in those sorts of of political debates and things where people are, are yelling at each other. They're really not that, they're interested, but they will confide in their friends, their peer groups, things like that. But openly being confrontational or, really talking about politics is really a kind of a difficult thing. As I say, you have people of course, there are many ways in which people can communicate now, electronically and in their own safe spaces, conservatives as well as liberals. So I think a lot of potential conflict gets avoided.
An aversion to conflict. That's interesting. You got to learn how to handle conflict.
Well, sure. Or you could just stay on your phone and not have to worry about conflict at all. And so I think that once again, there's a couple things happening at the same time. They have come of age at a time when politics has become angrier and louder, and they don't want that. And so my intro level classes are, which are politics classes, very, very little engagement. You could hear a pin drop sometimes when I'll ask sort of a broad-based question. And I think that
Alison,
because...
what do you do to stir the pot then?
Oh, I will...
That's what I want to know.
I will...
If you catch your students being indifferent or fooling around with their phones, what do you do?
Oh, no, I don't let them fool around on their phones. I make them all drop them at the front of the class.
Good for you.
Yeah, thank you. I learned. But what I'll do is I'll grab a student and say, okay, let's pretend that you are the Democratic Senate candidate from which great state, and they'll say Hawaii. And I'm like, okay, cool. What do you want to do? And I pull them out of themselves, put them into the idea of somebody else, and that gets the discussion.
Get them to play a role.
It gets them to play a role. Otherwise, this is also, we're still seeing kids who are the COVID generation, and they got so used to being on computers and being on screens and being on their phones all the time that is an easier way for them sometimes to discuss things. And so what all of the studies show is that if you are face to face with someone, even someone you disagree with, and you talk to them, the antipathy goes from here, right down. And so we try and organize these events where students can come and just talk and find common ground, not on anything political.
Sounds like you're kind of counseling.
It is, although I call it political speed dating, but they don't date. But that's exactly it. It's trying to get these kids out of their comfort zones, not in terms of changing their mind about their beliefs, but just understanding you can express your belief and not have somebody scream at you.
Yeah, there's role playing, as Alison said. You put students in small groups and have them discuss an issue, and that usually gets people at least talking, intimately to each other. A good rule of good teaching is to start with students from their own experiences. So maybe they don't want to talk about themselves, but they have this uncle, or they have family members, or they have friends in their community, and to talk about them. And so if they don't want to enter a conflict-ridden conversation, they will talk about how polarized their family is at Thanksgiving gatherings and things like that.
Now, I think we have time to talk about a poll that was reported in the New York Post, and they reported that 43% of Gen Z voters don't ID with either major party. So what does that mean for the development of these small parties coming up, Alison?
I'm not sure about the smaller parties, but I do think that the bigger parties have a lot of work to do to try and attract these students over to their side. And
are they working on it?
I think they are. And in a close primary state like Pennsylvania, I try and tell them that if you register as an independent, you are jacking yourself out of half of the elections you're legally allowed to vote in. So it's probably a good idea just to pick a side, and you could change sides, and you don't have to vote for that side when you go into the ballot box. But it's important that students see that right now we have a two-party system, and our third parties are trying, but they're not the most viable option at this moment in time.
Yeah, this is not a generational thing either. I think every generation of young people in every election cycle tend to register independent. I think being labeled or identifying yourself as partisan, I think is it may be just uncool. It may be that you're signaling that you're excluding certain kinds of people. I know this has been, since Trump has been a major party candidate, you don't really hear very much on campus about Trump or see very much about Trump. I think students are concerned that they're not, that if they identify themselves as Trump supporters, they will be regarded as racist or sexist, things like that. So it's not unusual what's happening among young people in terms of not identifying with a party at this point.
Our guests have been political science professors Alison Dagnes from Shippensburg University and Fletcher McClellan from Elizabethtown College. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
PCN's Ellen France talked with Representative Eric Nelson about people that vote twice during the same election.
Representative Eric Nelson, welcome to our program. You were recently a part of a press conference that raised awareness for a process known as double voting. Can you explain this process?
Yes, sure thing. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join the show and kind of spread what is a really important message about double voting. And that's a situation where given citizen, everybody has the right to vote in each election. The key is just one time. And so what we have come across and was a, issue that has come up in the past was an issue where somebody may live in one place and then also maintain an address in another, and they vote in both those places. It's the second vote that really is the area of concern.
How common has this been in previous elections?
Well, it's something that is talked about after the election when one side or the other is upset. And so part of our goal, and we started this a number of months ago, is to proactively both take a hard look at it. And then our focus has been trying to prevent double voting. So people, one, know that it's a felony, but this is not thousands of votes. It's not something that's going to change, in my opinion, the outcome of the presidential election, but it is really important for local elections that are often decided by a handful of votes.
What happens when somebody is caught double voting? What is their punishment?
Well, in Pennsylvania, it's a felony crime, a very serious crime. So you could be imprisoned for up to 7 years or fined $15,000. And so if we use the example of the gentleman from Montgomery County who double voted in multiple states and 5 different counties, my understanding was, in Pennsylvania, and that was just the confessed side of it, you can see how those charges really compound, because election integrity is essential for everyone. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle a person's on. It matters that everyone trusts the results. And that's why getting out in front and letting people know, hey, it's a felony crime. It's a big fine, and double voting leaves a distinct fingerprint that lasts for years for that individual.
How did this happen for the man like you mentioned in Montgomery County? How did he get away with registering to vote in multiple different counties without anything getting flagged?
Well, Ellen, that's a really good question, because what has happened is we don't have as robust or effective interstate cooperation. There used to be, there still is, a database called ERIC, and that was the Electronic Registration Information Center. And it was started back in 2013. Some states like California and New York have never participated in it, but other states more recently have stepped away. And so the goal of ERIC was that the states agree to share their voter registration data, and then they cross-reference that data if somebody moves, if somebody dies, if they pop up in different locations. What we've begun to realize in Pennsylvania specifically, now Ohio, West Virginia, Virginia, and New York all do not participate in ERIC. And when we were doing our research, Pennsylvania is limited. They send information to ERIC, but they can't fully use the information that ERIC may identify. And so it kind of happens, maybe it happens by accident. There might be some people that are intentionally trying to do it, or it could be individual voter responsibility. What I mean by that is oftentimes people move. When they move, they do a change of address for this new location, but they may not update their voter roll. And so that opens up an opportunity for somebody else to maybe take action with their registration based off of that address. And so, part of our goal and the reason we reached out to the Attorney General, to some local district attorneys, and to the Secretary of State, moving forward, we want to prevent it, and we want to do what some other states nationally have done to curb that behavior.
Last question, what can states such as Pennsylvania do to monitor this and prevent it from happening in the future?
Yeah, and that's super important. And there's a couple of things. Right out of the gate, earlier this week, we called on Governor Shapiro's administration and Secretary of State Al Schmidt. There are millions of dollars in election advertising and election awareness. And for them to include in that messaging that double voting is a felony. And just if people knew, if a college student who lives in Ohio but is maybe attending school in Pennsylvania heard a message like, whoa, I can't vote twice. Sometimes people don't realize. And that's a key short-term prevention. The next step is an MOA, and that's a memorandum of understanding with our neighboring states and then further. And that's what Florida, Mississippi, Alabama have done, so that their departments of state are working together to share that information and identify both bad actors or maybe somebody who has had their voter registration taken and they're not even aware of it.
Representative Eric Nelson, thank you for your time.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks.
Thanks to Ellen Frantz for that interview. Before we go, here's a reminder about tomorrow's Capitol Preview. We're focusing on the agenda in the State House. Majority Leader Matthew Bradford and Minority Leader Brian Cutler will be our guests. That's live tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.